Today's topic is an introduction to school Medicaid for administrators, or for anybody who's just really interested in learning what school Medicaid is. Hopefully we get this a good overview in a half an hour. My name is Bob Bundy. I am your pastry chef tour guide for today's session. As a matter of fact, for all the Lunchinars this series. My contact information is on the screen for just a couple minutes while I go over a couple of our normal Lunchinar ground rules. We don't talk about anything state specific. We try and keep our topics and our content at a high enough level that people from all over the country can participate and get value. We are recording the Lunchinars now, and we will be storing them on our site, making them available to people, after the webinar service gets done processing it and all that kind of stuff. All right, now a little bit about our Lunchinar series. For those of you who are new, we try and give at least one topic per month. Now, all these Lunchinars are designed to present information on a single topic at a time, and these are things we think folks in school Medicaid should be aware of. If you're interested in attending any of our upcoming Lunchinars, you can go out to our website, which is roqueservices.com. Go to the events menu. You'll see the list of topics that are available. Click on them, decide whether or not to register, just like you registered for this one. But once you put your information in, then anytime we schedule a Lunchinar in the future, you'll just receive an automatic email saying, hey, there's a new Lunchinar you might be interested in. I have a couple of objectives for today's session. First, I'm going to present a quick overview of Medicaid. Not school Medicaid, just Medicaid in general. So you kind of have a baseline. Then I will give you a quick overview on school Medicaid. And last, I'll present the three different components that can make up a school Medicaid program in a state. Now, not all states use all three of these components. Some don't use any of these components. There is one state out there, Wyoming, that does not have a school Medicaid program, but everybody else does. Okay, so those are my objectives for today. So first, let me talk about Medicaid in general. Medicaid was authorized in 1965 along with its partner Medicare. Both of them are national health programs that have specific areas that they cover. Medicare provides coverage to seniors. So a lot of, everybody when they turn 65, they go down and they register for Medicare, and then that helps provide medical coverage for the rest of their life. Medicaid was designed as a health program or a health coverage program for people who were, really poor, the very lowest of poverty levels, and folks who were disabled. Now, in 1966, which would have been the first year that school Medicaid was available, or not school Medicaid, Medicaid. Medicaid was available. It covered about 4 million people. 1966. Last year, 2017, Medicaid covered about 74 million people. So the program has really grown broadly, and I'll explain why in just a couple minutes, okay? But it's a partnership program between states and the federal government. It's also a voluntary program. States do not have to participate. However, today, all U.S. states do participate in Medicaid. And so the federal government chips in some money, and the states each individually chip in some money to pay for these Medicaid programs. Now, every year, the federal government goes through the list of every state, and they determine what percentage of money they're going to chip in for that state. They are required to chip in at least 50%. And the majority of states, that's what the federal government contributes, 50%. But when they look at it every year, they look at the poverty rate, and they look at healthcare in that state and the general health of the population. And the federal government might choose to chip in more than 50%. And that percentage that they do is called the FMAP, the Federal Medical Assistance Percentage. And so an FMAP in your state might be 50%, and right across the state line, the FMAP might be 70%. 70% is right around the area. There are a couple of states, I think they're maybe a little bit higher than 70, 71 or 72, meaning that the federal government is chipping in that money, 71 or 72% of every Medicaid dollar. So, if a Medicaid covered person goes to the doctor and the bill is $100, the doctor is going to send that claim into Medicaid, and he's going to get a check for $100. If the FMAP for that state is 70%, then the federal government is chipping in $70 to give that doctor, and the state is chipping in $30. That's kind of the way Medicaid funding works. Now, every state has control of their own state Medicaid plan. There is a state plan for every state that describes what the state's Medicaid program looks like. Medicaid requires some very specific coverages, and every state kind of has to not kind of, they do have to offer this base core of services, but they can choose to offer additional services over and above that if they'd like to, and they do that in their state plan. So every state has a Medicaid state plan, and every year if they want to make changes, they write down the changes in an amendment of the plan, and they send that in to CMS, which is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which oversees the Medicaid program. And they say, CMS, we'd like to make a change to our state plan, and here's what we want to do. CMS looks at it. They might ask some questions. They might ask the state to change a few things, but eventually they'll approve it. They'll send it back, and the state will start operating under that new plan. Now, it's not unusual for a state to submit and get approved 50 changes every year, but it's not unusual for them to ask for only 5 changes or 10 changes. Just depends on the state and what they're trying to do with their plan. Every state also manages their own Medicaid program. They're responsible for enrolling people. They're responsible for signing up providers, not just doctors, but also hospitals and nursing homes, those sort of things. They pay the claims. They do all the training. They do all the audits, all those kind of things. So states are responsible for defining their program and managing their program. Now that's Medicaid in general. School-based Medicaid is a portion of a state's Medicaid program. Let's talk about that real quick. School-based Medicaid was authorized in 1988, whereas regular Medicaid was authorized in 65, so 23 years later, okay? Authorized in this Catastrophic Coverage Act of 1988, which has mostly been repealed. That was an act that gave lots of new services on the Medicare to seniors, which seniors were really excited about, but it also imposed premiums on seniors, which the seniors hated. And so Congress has pretty much rolled back that entire act, except for the school Medicaid portion. Inside the Department of Education Acts, IDEA, which was 1997 authorization of special education, and IDEIA, which was the 2004 reauthorization. They both have language and regulations in there about school-based Medicaid. And then, of course, as I mentioned, every state has its own state Medicaid plan, which defines what their school Medicaid program looks like. There are lots and lots of agencies involved. Federal agencies, state agencies, local agencies. I tend to use the term school districts, but I know that there are lots of states where Medicaid actually occurs at the Medicaid billing actually occurs at the cooperative level, you know, something like an IU, an intermediate unit in Pennsylvania, or a AEA in Iowa, those kind of things, okay? Now, what does that mean to a school district? Well, here's the deal. A school district is providing services, or they could provide services to their community or to their students. And if they're enrolled in the school-based Medicaid program, the state Medicaid agency will reimburse them some portion of the cost that they incurred to provide those services. So school-based Medicaid is all about tapping into a revenue stream for school districts for providing services. Some of those services they're required to provide, and some of those services they just provide because they're part of the Medicaid program. And we'll talk about the difference of those, okay? So school districts who participate in school Medicaid receive revenue from the state Medicaid agency for their participation. And a couple things about that revenue. It varies widely. There are school districts that receive a total of, $10,000 from the school Medicaid program for what they do. There are school districts that receive tens of millions of dollars, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with the size of the school district. Two school districts that are exactly the same size, providing the exact same services in different states, could vary widely in the amount of money that they receive in reimbursement for the program. Okay. Now, generally speaking, the money coming from Medicaid is money coming from a federal agency. And I think any of you who are have been in the education world, you know that school districts, public school districts, are restricted in how they spend certain dollars. So when school districts get their IDEA grant or their special education grant, they cannot use that money to go out and buy a new artificial turf football field, because they have to spend that money on special education related activities or expenses. Okay. And it's like that with other things too, title grants and that sort of stuff. But even though Medicaid is a federal program, the money that comes back in the reimbursement is not classified that way as federal dollars that must be spent only one way. Generally speaking, across the country, that money comes back to a school district and it goes into its general fund. And so most school districts around the country could spend their Medicaid reimbursement program dollars on an artificial turf football field. Okay, they could do that. Now, there are a few states that actually limit that or restrict that. And so Colorado, for example, is one that I know off the top of my head. Any money that's generated from the school Medicaid program must be spent on student health programs, either back into special education or other student health programs. And there are restrictions or guidelines like that in a few states around the country. But generally speaking, the money can come back and go into the general fund and be spent however school districts really want to spend it. Now, why would school districts choose to participate in school Medicaid? Because generally speaking, participation in this program is voluntary. School districts don't have to participate, except in a few states. I do know that Connecticut and New Jersey both mandate their school districts' participation. Outside of those states, there may be some other states that mandate that, but I'm just not aware of them. But in other states, it's just voluntary. So if a school district doesn't want to participate, they don't have to. The reason they participate is the revenue, okay? Especially if they could be reimbursed for services that they are already providing. If they're providing these services and incurring that expense, and they could be reimbursed for some of that expense, that's why they would choose to participate. Now, why would they choose not to participate? Because again, if it's voluntary, why not? The bottom two bullets are really the ones that mean something here for most school districts. When a school district participates in school Medicaid, additional documentation is required. And that's required by the Medicaid agency to support the delivery of those services. And it's real similar to the documentation that's required at a hospital or a doctor's office to document the delivery of those services. So even if a school district has really good processes in place and good systems and all that kind of stuff, they do have to add this level of documentation. And again, when I work with school districts who are new to this, that's one of their biggest issues is the additional paperwork. And we kind of talk through the process. If you set up your systems and your process up front, it's not that big of a deal. It just becomes part of your normal routine. The last bullet there is that school districts all of a sudden have to start dealing with a new agency. That is the state Medicaid agency. Obviously, if you're not participating in the school Medicaid program, you don't have to deal with them. But the minute you do participate, you are dealing with them. There's communications back and forth. There's paperwork that goes back and forth. And there is oversight and audits. And I'll talk about that in just a couple minutes too. Okay, so that's a little bit, a very high level of what school Medicaid programs are. So now I'm going to talk about the three different components that can make up the school Medicaid plan in a state. Okay, now again, there are some states that have all three of these. Not very many. There are only 5 or 6 of these, or 5 or 6 states that have all three of these. The majority, the vast majority of states have 2 of these components. There are a few states that only have 1 component. And there's one state, Wyoming, which has none of these because Wyoming doesn't have a school Medicaid program. They've actually had bills introduced in their legislature the last few sessions, and I expect they'll have another one introduced pretty soon in their legislature, and they'll probably pass, but you never know. So I'm going to start first with administrative claiming, which goes by a few different names. Okay, MAC, you'll hear people, if you walk in and talk about Medicaid, you'll hear people talk about their MAC dollars or their MAC program. That's Medicaid Administrative Claiming, or SDAC, School District Administrative Claiming, or admin claiming. Okay, this is a component of a school Medicaid program that basically reimburses school districts for doing some work that the state Medicaid agency would do themselves if they had a lot of people. So here's the deal. The state Medicaid agency knows that having healthy people is good. It's good for the for kids, it's good for the workforce, it's good for the elderly, it's just good all over. And that's why they develop these programs. But the state Medicaid agency doesn't have a lot of employees. And they'd love to go out into the everywhere in their state and find anybody who's eligible or could take advantage of these programs. They just don't have the resources. But they know that there's a school district that touches every portion of their state, whether they're a big state or a little state. And so basically what they say is, school districts, if you will have some of your staff do some community outreach and educate some of the people in the community about our programs, we'll reimburse you for your time. Okay, so that's pretty easy to understand, but let me give you a quick illustration of this from a school district operational side of this, okay? We've got a school, we have an assistant principal. This assistant principal knows about the state Medicaid programs that are available. She's had some training, she has some materials, and the family walks in. They're here to register their kids because they're just new to the school district and they're going to register their kids. During this meeting, this assistant principal recognizes that this family may not have health coverage. They may not have it for their kids or for the whole family. And so she takes off her principal hat for a second, sets it aside, and she starts talking to them about Medicaid programs that are available in the state. Now, this really has nothing to do with education. It just happens that she is in a position to help the Medicaid agency get the word out about this. So maybe she has some pamphlets or brochures, or she has some forms, or she can tell them, where the local office is, that maybe they could go and get the kids covered by the CHIP program, or maybe the whole family covered. So after a few minutes, she gets done kind of telling them about that. She puts her principal hat back on, and then she registers the kids and all that kind of stuff. Now, at some point, she's going to take her time that she spent and she's going to turn that in, either on paper or electronically. And anybody else in that school district who does the same thing, maybe some other assistant principals or a guidance counselor or something like that, they're going to send in all their time that they spent, and they're going to compile it. The school district's going to compile it into a single claim, and they're going to send that claim to the state Medicaid agency. And they said, Medicaid agency, our staff on your behalf reached out to the community and provided information. They provided this much time and it cost us this much money with salaries and everything. Can you reimburse us for that, please? Okay, state Medicaid agency is going to look at that. It's a single claim. Maybe it came in monthly, or maybe it comes in quarterly. It's pretty normal for school districts to turn that in quarterly. One claim quarterly, and there's maybe 10 people's time on there. And they look at it and they apply the rules and they apply the rates and they do their calculations and they say, we do owe you this money, here you go. And they send a check back to the school district. Okay, that's kind of operationally, obviously very high level how administrative claiming works. Now I'm going to talk about the direct services claim or a portion of school Medicaid program around special education services. Now, this is when you talk to people about school Medicaid, this is the one that has the most visibility, has the most people involved. 99 out of 100 people who knew anything about school Medicaid would know about this portion of the program. They may not know about administrative claiming that we just talked about. So let me talk about this real quick. It goes by lots of different names in different states. Some states call it fee-for-service Medicaid, or direct service claiming, or IEP Medicaid, or special ed Medicaid. Lots of different names, but here's what it is. Medicaid, well, let me put it this way. School districts are required to provide certain services to students who are receiving special education services. And some of those services are medical services. If they are required to provide those medical services and that child is eligible for Medicaid, then the state Medicaid agency will reimburse the school district at least a portion of their cost to provide that service. So this one, the school district is providing direct medical services to individual students because it's required on their IEP. And if any of you are not familiar with special education is highly regulated, and every student who's receiving special education services has what's called an individualized education plan, IEP. And it basically says what this child needs and what services the school district will be providing. And part of that IEP is a section called the services section. And here I have an example that talking about of an IEP page that talks about medical services. And in this case, this IEP calls for speech therapy in a group setting as opposed to an individual setting. And this student is going to receive 3 sessions per week, and each session will be 20 minutes long. Now, the minute that IEP is approved and signed, this school district starts providing those services. So let's look at, again, another illustration of how this might work in the school Medicaid world to get reimbursement back to the school district. So we have an IEP team, they're meeting, they're filling out the IEP, and remember the IEP team includes the parents, they're talking about the different services that this student may need, and they determine and they write down on the IEP that this student requires physical therapy, for whatever reason. And the minute that IEP is effective, that school district assigns a physical therapist. So let's say it's 3 sessions a week for 30 minutes. So 3 times a week, that physical therapist meets with that student, does a therapy session. And at the end of each of those sessions, he or she documents the service that they just performed, either on paper or electronically. Each of those 3 services in that week becomes an individual claim. Okay, so unlike administrative claiming, where we did one claim for the whole school district for the quarter, each service session is its individual claim. Now, she's going to see that student for some period of time, not just that week, maybe 6 weeks or 6 months. Each one of those sessions can become a claim, but he's not the only student she sees. So each of those sessions could become a claim. And again, she's not the only provider in the school district. They have occupational therapists, audiologists, nurses, all that kind of stuff. So you can see all these things multiplying. It's not just one claim, it can be tons of claims. It's not unusual at all for even medium-sized school districts to generate hundreds or thousands of claims per week during the school year. Now, school district's going to take all those claims, they're going to bundle them up, however they do that, they're going to send them to the state Medicaid agency, and they're going to say, hey, we're required to provide all these medical services and to all these Medicaid eligible kids, and here's our claim and of what, for reimbursement. And again, Medicaid agency is going to go through each of them, they're going to adjudicate it, apply the rules, apply their pricing formulas, and they're going to say, you're right, here's your money back. Okay, so direct service, obviously a lot different than administrative claiming. Administrative claiming is outreach to the community, kind of working on behalf of your state Medicaid agency. And direct service is providing direct medical service inside your school district to kids and being reimbursed for that. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to talk real quick about direct service considerations. Each of these 6 areas could be, and probably is, its own little Lunchinar in our program here. I'm not going to take a lot of time on each of these, but remember I said 99 out of 100 people would know direct service Medicaid as opposed to administrative claiming, and here's why, because there's so many moving parts. First, let me just hit a couple of things. Authorization. What authorizes a state Medicaid agency to pay a school district to reimburse them for these services? Well, in a lot of states, the IEP is the authorizing document. If it lists a valid service, a covered service, and it's signed by a licensed provider, that's all the Medicaid agency needs to authorize the delivery of that service or the reimbursement for that service. However, in some states, they require additional approval. So in Arkansas, for example, not only does the IEP have to be all signed and lined up, but then the school district has to send it to a physician. And that physician has to approve all this stuff, or they have to review everything, and then they have to write an approval prescription to send in for reimbursement. Now, that's an additional level of administrative paperwork and overhead that's way above just having a signed IEP. Okay. Some other states require additional Medicaid agency pre-approvals. So the IEP calls for speech therapy, for example, and before the school district can file for reimbursement, they have to send it to the state Medicaid agency to be reviewed first, and the Medicaid agency has to approve it with a pre-approval before they can pay any claims on that. And again, if you have your processes in place, it's maybe not terrible, but it's still kind of a pain to have to do that kind of paperwork. Now, Next one is parental consent. And as I mentioned earlier, we're doing a parental consent Lunchinar next week. We're doing that real quick into the school year because of all the confusion and questions. So I won't go into a lot of detail here. But when a school district sends in a claim for a service that they provided to a student to the Medicaid agency, they have to have written parental consent to send that information to the Medicaid agency. So even though they've been providing that service to that student for 6 months, if the parents have never signed a written consent, they can't send it in and have it claimed. And again, not that big of a deal. The regulations were smoothed out about 5 years ago. Still a lot of confusion, still a lot of questions, but it's another level of administrative overhead and paperwork that school districts have to deal with direct services. And the last one is compliance. And I mentioned this earlier. The minute you start dealing with your state Medicaid agency, it's not a question of if you'll be audited. It's when you will be audited. You know, in your personal life, you can go your whole life and never have the IRS audit your taxes. I'm sure it happens to millions and millions of people. School districts and school Medicaid, not that way. When you participate, you will be audited. It might be that you're audited every year. I know of one state where every school district goes through an audit every quarter of their school Medicaid program. It might be that your state has sort of a rotating audit schedule where you're audited every other year or every third year or something like that. And again, you know, a lot of school districts, when they're looking at getting into school Medicaid, this is the part that kind of worries them. Oh, we're going to be audited. And the thing that I tell them is, if you set up your processes, if you set up your workflows, if you have your files set up correctly, an audit is no big deal. When you are audited, yes, you have to pull your files together and make them available. But if you're preparing for that up front, not that big a deal. But again, lots of overhead, okay, in the direct services side. The third one, direct services for medical services provided to general education students. Now, it operates the exact same way for the most part as the one we just saw. We've got a student who requires a medical service. We're providing that service to him. We're filing for reimbursement. However, these are not students who are receiving special education services. These are general education services, or general education students. So it could be a student who has to go to the nurse every day to get an insulin injection. That's a medical service. It's required. It's not a special ed student or a student receiving special ed services. It could be a student who had a terrible accident, who can come back to school but still needs some personal care services that are listed in their 504 plan. And so they have things like, you know, positioning and moving and, you know, those kind of things in their 504 plan for some period of time. And again, that's something that if it's in the state plan, could be reimbursed. Now, I mentioned earlier that not many states take advantage of this yet. And that's because the rules for school Medicaid allowing this kind of service were changed about 4 years ago. Not all states were in a position when that change was made to start taking advantage of it, because they have to change their state plan. And remember, I said they have to change their state plan to get big changes through. They have to send it in to CMS. It has to receive approval. Well, there was a lot of confusion here, a lot of anxiety about this. And so a lot of people have been watching other states to see what happens. And so there are 5 or 6 states that I'm aware of that have started this kind of a program: California, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, South Carolina. Who else? Louisiana, I think, is one, maybe New Jersey. Those are states that have gotten approval to provide these services and be reimbursed for them from the school Medicaid program. Now, I know we have a Lunchinar schedule for sometime this school year to talk about this type of Medicaid reimbursement component, because this introduces a whole lot of operational challenges to school districts. So we'll talk about that more in a full Lunchinar. Okay, a quick summary. I gave you kind of a high-level overview of just Medicaid, and then a quick high-level overview of school Medicaid and why school districts would choose to participate or not participate. Talked about the revenue and what that means to school districts. And then I talked about the individual components that could make up a school Medicaid program. Okay, admin claiming direct services for both students receiving special ed services and for general education kids. If any of you are new to school Medicaid, this is your first year, a couple of places where you can get other resources. There is a LinkedIn discussion group on school Medicaid. LinkedIn is like Facebook for work, where people have their professional community, and their discussion groups have places where you can post articles and post questions and get responses from the community. I think that discussion group has almost 200 people in it now. We just started it a little over a year ago. And lots of articles on school Medicaid out there, lots of information. People do post questions and people from around the country respond. So if you have a LinkedIn account, which is free, you can go to the groups area, which again is free, and join. Next one is NAME. That's National Alliance for Medicaid and Education, which is a national association for anybody who's involved in school Medicaid. NAME has about 500 members, I think, people from the federal level down to the local school district level, billing companies, state Medicaid agencies, all that kind of stuff. And the reason I promote NAME is they have a really great members-only website where you get lots of resources. You get documents, you get tools, you get research, all kinds of things. Plus, you get access to all the people. On our website, which again is roqueservices.com, there's I've got these three things circled here. Resources is where we have lots of documents out there. Lots of tools. That's where the recordings for these Lunchinars will be stored. School Medicaid News is where we post links to school Medicaid articles from around the country. And I think we're up to like 400 or 500 articles out there. And basically I tell people, you really should know what's going on in your state for school Medicaid, but it's a good idea to learn what's going on around the country. Here is my contact information again, if anybody has questions or comments you want to talk afterwards. Thank you all very much for participating. Hopefully you have a great International Chocolate Day, and we'll see you on an upcoming Lunchinar.